So this is a slightly different camera setup than we had before. You like this? You might have to ask your parents about backward masking. That was kind of a big deal back in the 70s and 80s. But NCFCA has adopted as its wildcard event for next year After Dinner Speaking, and I thought that was kind of an exciting prospect because it is a difficult event to do well. But if you can rise to the challenge, you wind up with a really important tool in your toolbox as a speaker. You wind up with a much more developed understanding of how humor works and what does it look like when it doesn't work. And you can avoid a lot of difficulty with that and really make yourself a lot more effective if you go through the process of honing your abilities in that area. So I am going to make a series of 3 videos, and then I have a 4th one that I might tack on after that are intended to help you if you want to give After Dinner Speaking a try. And I have 2 experiences in my past that I can offer up. One of them is during the time I was at Arizona State University. I was the head debate coach, so I primarily worked with the debaters. I didn't do that much work with the team members who primarily did IEs, but I was at some of their practice sessions and work sessions, and I saw how some of their pieces developed over the years. And that year, one of the team members, named Brian, was AFA National Champion in After Dinner Speaking. So I can share some of what I remember about what he did, and in particular, I have an illustration that I've used since in teaching my public speaking classes, because I still have a video of that final round. Now I don't have the intellectual property rights to it, so I can't put it up. And there are some moments in some of those speeches that I really wouldn't want to share on the NCU YouTube channel. But there are 3 speakers in particular in that final round, Brian and 2 others, that I show their speeches commonly in my public speaking classes, and we talk about them, and there's an important distinction that we draw that's true for public speaking in general, but especially true for After Dinner Speaking, and I want to take a minute and walk through that with you. One of the speakers in the final round was named Rajni, and Rajni was born in India, lived there for a few years, and then came to the United States. This particular year, she was national champion in extemp, AFA national champion. She was in the finals in a couple of platform events. She had a reputation of really having her act together on her research and her substance. It was almost a little bit surprising to see her in the finals of After Dinner Speaking, because that event is a little bit more about being energetic and entertaining, and that just didn't seem to be something that was up her alley. Her speech was very, very tightly constructed. Very, very carefully researched, and you could tell when you listened to it that they'd written a solid speech and then layered the humor on top. Then looked for openings to put in a joke. It was a speech first, and then it was funny. Now, another speaker in the round was named Sarah. Sarah's topic was kind of loose, and she did the things that you have to have. You don't get to the finals of nationals without having all of your fundamentals in order. She had research. She had threads running through the speech. She had something she was trying to say, a serious point that she was building up, but that serious point was not her emphasis. A lot of her jokes were just out of nowhere. It was almost an excuse to say things that were unexpected, one after another, for the sake of getting laughs. And so really, she spent her 10 minutes playing with the audience. And the speech was almost an afterthought. It was more about her performance than it was about the content. And I show those 2 speeches, and then I show Brian's speech. And what I usually am able to bring out in the discussion is that Brian did both. What Brian did is he had a carefully put together speech. It was a speech first, but it was not a speech only. He then had worked over the course of the year, and it came naturally to him to a certain extent. He was a funny guy. But he knew how to watch for the audience's reactions and play with them, and take happy accidents that happened in the speech and do something with them and feed into the audience's energy. And that was something that Sarah was wonderful at and Rajni was not incredibly good at. But Rajni had a solid speech that a lot of judges liked, and Sarah had almost cotton candy for her speech, which turned off some judges. And so Brian's strength was that he had both. A carefully crafted speech that was then wrapped up in a performance that interplayed with the audience. And if you want to be successful at After Dinner Speaking, that's the objective. And as you go into the first tournament of the year, and as you go into nationals, those are your objectives. A really, really good speech on its merits that then, through the performance, turns into something that is really, really enjoyable and memorable. All right. So the second thing that I wanted to do in this video, why don't I take a second and, actually, why don't I tell you, because I started to tell you there are 2 experiences I've had that I can offer up that can help you prepare to put together your first after-dinner speech, and I've only told you about one, working with Arizona State. The other experience I had was in the fall 2011 term, so not very long ago. I had a special topics class come up in my teaching rotation. A special topics class can be about anything. And so I talked to a couple of students, and I took an idea that I had bouncing around in my head, and the special topics class I taught was humor and stand-up comedy. And during the course of the term, we examined what exactly is humor, what makes things funny, and we talked through some theories that go back thousands of years. I mean, we're going to go back to Plato. But we also talked about some contemporary theory coming out of linguistics. And we tied that together. Every student in the class had to put together a stand-up comedy routine and perform it. And one of the stand-up comedy routines, I have to talk to him and make sure it's okay, but it was given, we wound up at the end of the semester having a showcase night and for the entire campus, and the audience members got to vote on who was the funniest. And Mark's he was the winner, and Mark was also a member of the forensics team. He was a Speakin' Beacon. And as soon as I touch base with him, I'm going to try to put his up as the 4th video in this series, because a lot of what I talk about, a lot of the techniques and a lot of the principles, you'll be able to see some really easy illustrations in there. Now, before I go any further, you know, and I assume that you know, that an after-dinner speech is not a stand-up comedy routine. They're different. An after-dinner speech is a speech. It's a speech with a serious point, but it's a speech that is made more effective by the interweaving of humor. I'll talk a lot about stand-up comedy, not because they're the same thing, but because the process of building a really powerful after-dinner speech looks a lot like the process whereby you generate enough material to have a good stand-up comedy routine, and then arrange it so that it flows well. A lot of the techniques that work for one work for the other. But where we're going to begin, I have a couple of the theories of why things are funny that have withstood the test of time, and I want to talk through them in this video, and I'll refer back to them in the videos that follow. But, okay, let me just get on to them. These are some of the early foundational topics from that class on humor and stand-up comedy. So, one of the theories of what makes things funny that has stood the test of time is that humor is at its heart about superiority, about you feeling superior to someone else. That's the reason we laugh at clowns when they fall down, when they're silly. That's the reason that you might laugh at redneck jokes, or that you might laugh at blonde jokes, that you might laugh at the Three Stooges. And it's also the reason that when people who are high and mighty are knocked down, and you get to feel superior to them, prior to them being knocked down, you don't get to, but when they are made absurd, when something really embarrassing happens to them, then you do get to feel superior, which is why it's not funny to go take a banana cream pie and throw it in the face of a homeless person. That's just cruel. But to take a banana cream pie and throw it in the face of a Wall Street banker, or to take a banana cream pie and throw it in the face of the Queen of England, set it up with the right context, and you'll get a huge laugh out of that. Now, that's the theory that Plato and Aristotle and Thomas Hobbes all thought was the lifeblood of comedy, that explained all or nearly all jokes. And as a matter of fact, Plato warned that the stories of the gods needed to have every trace of humor removed, because he said if young people could laugh at the gods, then they would feel superior to them. And that was the first dangerous seed of hubris. Now, it's also been noted that the overwhelming majority of humor in the Bible is in this vein. So the Psalms talk about how God laughs to scorn the nations. And we actually had a speaker from Vanderbilt Seminary on campus a couple of years ago who made the argument that the entire book of Judges was the almost vaudeville comedy of ancient Israel, because the characters in it are so inept. Because Gideon is a wimp, Barak is such a bad general that Deborah has to lead the military, and Samson, he may be strong and he may win a lot of battles, but he's also kind of a clod. So, the fact that you can look down on all of them, what makes them funny is how dumb they are, how silly they are, how misguided and foolish they are. Now the thing is, we do not tend to laugh at things that are life and death. We do not tend to laugh at things that make us feel very frightened or make us feel very small. And we don't tend to laugh at things that are overwhelmingly powerful. So you'll rarely find that someone is handed their firstborn child and has that very powerful, meaningful experience and finds it funny. They may laugh. If they laugh, it's out of joy or it's out of surprise. But it will not tend to be because they're amused by it. Mel Brooks has a really good line about this. He says, "Tragedy is when I cut my finger. Comedy is when you fall down an open manhole cover and die. Because then, I can look down on you, and that's what makes it funny." So, even though Plato, Aristotle, and Thomas Hobbes all said this is the lifeblood, that humor, nearly all humor relies on this, when we really put it to the test, there are things you can find that are funny where superiority is not involved. There's a lot of humor that comes out of nowhere. And one example that gets passed around a lot among humor theorists is the college roommates who all lived together. Apparently this was part of a paper on humor research early in its days. And what the roommates loved to do is they loved to play pranks on each other, but the unwritten rule of the game of pranks was the pranks couldn't make any sense. They had to be as random as possible. And so one of the roommates took the other one's bowling ball and hid it in the refrigerator. And so the other roommate goes looking for his bowling ball. Can't find it anywhere, is turning the house upside down, gets frustrated, gives up for the time being, goes to the refrigerator to get himself something to drink. There's his bowling ball. And it's cold. And if that story's told properly, and if I have a warmed-up audience, it's the kind of thing that you can get a pretty big laugh with, and there's no real superiority-inferiority involved. I mean, you could stretch and say that because he doesn't know where it is, and you do know where it is, you're superior to him, but that's really kind of stretching it pretty far. So it may be fair to say that within the universe of things that are funny, superiority-inferiority relationships are very common. It's one potential source of very funny things if you can help your audience to feel superior to someone who's foolish or inept or something like that. Now the second theory that's kind of passed the test of time that explains why things are funny, or why modestly funny things become very funny, is the theory of emotional tension and release. Now there are two pretty close together variants on this. One of them proposed by Herbert Spencer, and the other one by Sigmund Freud. Herbert Spencer's version, he pointed out how laughter is the kind of thing that will break tension in a hostile or frightening situation. You may have been in some encounter where someone says something that crosses the line and everybody just freezes. Nobody wants to say anything, nobody wants to do anything, nobody wants to be the next one to speak. And then some wise, blessed soul manages to make everyone laugh and the tension just pops like a balloon. And humor can have that effect. And in particular, people feel free to laugh because the tension is breaking, and that moment of the tension breaking is what spurs the laugh. You may also have noticed that when filmmakers are making a horror movie, very often they'll throw in just one or two scenes where there's comic relief to temporarily break the tension so they don't wear out their audience and desensitize the audience to the emotional manipulation of the film. So that was Herbert Spencer's argument that is the sort of tension and release function that humor serves. Sigmund Freud had a slightly different one. He said that we laugh at what is a release from the constraints we operate under all the time. We're not supposed to feel a certain way, and we tell ourselves we will not feel that way, but deep down we want to feel that way. And laughing lets us feel it while distancing ourselves from the feeling. So it's the laughter, it's the jokes that rely on taboos. And a lot of the taboos are in very poor taste. So if you've ever heard over the years quadruple amputee jokes, if you've ever heard over the years Helen Keller jokes, almost every time there's a tragedy, people start making jokes about the tragedy. Every time there's been a space shuttle disaster, there are jokes about the space shuttle. There were jokes about the Boston Marathon bombing almost as soon as it happened. And those, you're not supposed to find those funny. But because you're not supposed to, that actually makes them funnier still. There's a comedian by the name of John Cleese. He was one of the members of Monty Python's Flying Circus. And after he left Monty Python, he and his wife wrote a television series called Fawlty Towers. And he played the owner and manager of a hotel, Basil Fawlty. And they only made 12 episodes of it. It very often reaches the top of lists of the funniest TV series ever made. He says they stopped after 12 episodes because they had done an episode on every taboo that he could think of, and they had run out of taboos. They had one episode where within the first 5 minutes, they had a guest die, and then they had to try to sneak the dead body out of the building without anybody catching them. And there are all these near misses and all these kind of weird situations that come up from them trying to sneak the body out. Those might have been funny on their own, but according to this theory, the theory of tension and release, it's because you're not supposed to be laughing. It's wrong to laugh at the fact that someone died. What kind of sick person laughs at someone dying? And then there's also the tension of they don't want to get caught. They'll be embarrassed if they're caught in their hotel with a dead body. Their hotel guests will feel uncomfortable, might not want to stay there anymore, so they try to conceal it. And that tension makes the jokes even funnier. So they can, at that point, can tell almost any joke they want because they've cultivated in the audience that feeling of being on edge, of being a little uncomfortable, almost like being tickled. And so that's sort of a very fertile soil in which to sow your jokes. Okay, so this, I have to say, is a little bit more of a theory of laughter than it is a theory of humor. And the relationship between laughter and humor is tricky because it is the case that if someone tells something that's a joke or a story and it's funny, a common response is to laugh. But it's also the case that people laugh all the time in situations that have nothing to do with humor. And there are some interpersonal communication theorists who've actually recorded people interacting in natural settings and have found, correcting for age and culture and gender and all of that, but they found sometimes up to 80 to 85% of times that people laugh, there is nothing recognizable as a joke or funny story that it follows. It's almost punctuating the rhythm of the conversation. And it's almost including, showing approval. There are all these other messages. Sometimes people laugh just because they're startled. So the release of emotional tension, it's not necessarily, it's sort of a force magnifier for humor, but it doesn't really get at why are things funny in the first place. I think the theory that does the best job of that's probably the third, and the third is incongruity. Incongruity is the theory of humor that Immanuel Kant and Arthur Schopenhauer both defended. It's the idea that we laugh when we discover something that we didn't expect, when there's a sudden discovery of something you didn't expect. Now, a real quick illustration of incongruity. You're sitting at a stoplight and you're watching the cross stoplight, and you see that it's green, and then it turns yellow, and then what if it suddenly turned purple? That moment that you would feel, that double take you would do, that's incongruity. Now, not all incongruities are funny. There's some incongruities that are just nonsensical. There's some incongruities that are bad, where something happens that you didn't expect and it's negative. But there are a lot of incongruities, if certain other circumstances are met, that can give you just the right tickle to produce something that people recognize as funny and to trigger a laugh. So one of the things I have to say is the other two theories, the theory of superiority and the theory of emotional tension and release, they cannot account for why a joke is not as funny if you've heard it before. And they cannot account for why a joke is not as funny if you figure it out midway through. Because if superiority explains humor, well, you're just as superior on the second hearing. And if emotional tension and release explains that things that are taboo are funny, they're still taboo the second time you hear them. But what the theory of incongruity gets at is when you already have figured out the twist in the joke, then it's no longer a twist. So, I have a few examples in here to illustrate how things that have an incongruity in the middle become funny because of it. So there are two fish in a tank, and someone came in and gave them fish food and cleaned their filter. Is that funny? No, because it gets to the end of the statement and it stays in one world. But then, and this is a joke you've probably heard, it's made the rounds, there are two fish in a tank, and one of them looks at the other and says, "Do you know how to drive this thing?" Through the first half of the joke, the two fish are in an aquarium, and then you find out tank doesn't mean aquarium. Tank means big military armored vehicle with a turret on top and treads on the side. And then I actually heard another variant on it the other day. I'm not sure I can pull off the sound effect, but I'm going to try. Forgive me if I kind of muff it a little bit. So there are two soldiers in a tank, and one of them looks at the other and says, I don't know, maybe that didn't work. But the discovery midway through that you're in a different world than you thought you were to begin with. Another example, the puns, almost all puns, or almost all humor that relies on play on words, those are also operating under the principle of incongruity. So I wondered why the baseball was getting bigger and bigger, then it hit me. And for 1 second, then it hit me, you think, then I realized, and then the other interpretation of it, then it hit me, boom, goes the baseball. And the other one, I'm reading a book about anti-gravity, it's impossible to put down. And this one I'm not going to dissect by walking you through, this is how the punchline works. But that's the principle behind it, that in the middle of the joke, there's a discovery, there's a second interpretation. Now that incongruity has to be something pleasant. Pleasant for the listener, at least, to discover. If the incongruity, there are lots of incongruities, I mentioned already, that are unpleasant. You discover that you're not living in the world you thought you were living in, and it's bad news or a negative experience. And so when you're constructing your jokes and you're trying to figure out what's going to work, you want to make sure that the discovery is in some sense pleasing, that it's clever, it's witty, it's got that quality to it. So that's a little bit of vocabulary that we're going to come back to when we talk about how to generate humorous material. But keep in mind, what you want to do in putting together an after-dinner speech is you want to braid together commitment to the material, commitment to the audience. And you want to be on the lookout for opportunities to leverage superiority, emotional tension, possibly including taboo, although given your league and your judges' expectations, you have to be very cautious about that. And then finally, incongruity, the twist, the discovery in the middle that is the reason that humor is its funniest when it's fresh and when it's not worn out. Those are some bedrock principles, and we will build on that foundation in the videos to come.